here we are. This is Sex Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat, bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more. A concept of identity really fascinates me, and I feel like it's how we pick the words, how we pick the images, or how we pick the clothing to communicate to the world how we want to be understood, whether this is an intentional process or not. You come forward and talk about how there's a whole alchemy that can happen with identity. So I'd be curious about how you see the concept of identity as a whole picture. Like, what do you see as the benefit of the concept of identity, or where do you see some of the pitfalls? Where do you see some of the challenges?
Yeah, I think that's a whole can of worms.
Get into it. Let's go. Let's open that can.
Well, it's interesting because I my background is in photography, and I've done tons of branding for big brands and celebrities and magazines and all these things. And that in and of itself became my identity, is being this big commercial photographer shooting celebrities and brands like Nike and Reebok and all these things. And then my business just started at a certain point when social media came on the scene and was on the rise. My business started crashing, and I started crashing, and I got to a point where I was in a mental spiral of what was happening. Like, I did not know up from down. And my friend Lewis got me into this thing called MITT. I don't know if you've done it or heard of it. And that was really life-changing for me in a certain space, because I realized like how much my identity was wrapped up in who I was, in the external validation of being a photographer and an artist, shooting all these different brands and these people. And when that started crashing, I started crashing. And so I didn't realize that my identity, like my self-worth, was tied into the identity of that, right? So that was like kind of the first realization of that. The term identity alchemy is pretty new in my world. We just kind of started developing this out this last year, because as I've reflected on the different phases of my life, the identity alchemy process kind of came through, and it's a process of deconstruction, curation, and becoming. And the thing is, regardless if you're building a personal brand or not, we're always going through an identity shift. And I think the big thing is like we get wrapped up in thinking that we actually are the identity that we have created in this world. But really, this is just a platform to play out an identity. We're actors, right? We're acting out, we are spiritual beings acting out an identity that we create in the world. So the alchemy piece is the inner alchemy of A, realizing that, and B, how do we create who we want to be in the world? And that starts with our inner thought world and our inner energetics and our inner like emotional frequency. So the more we can shift the inner frequency, that our construct and narrative, the more we're developing our mind, the more we create. We're constantly creating. If you're in the world of becoming a better person, you're reading books, you're listening to podcasts, you're adopting new narratives and new belief systems, and those belief systems trickle out into who you are being in the world. And that is technically your identity, right? Your identity could be like the ego, and that's a whole
like
other
a sense
play.
of separateness.
So your sense of self, as it relates to this world, as it relates to how you interact in this world. Your personal brand, now that's an even bigger extension of the identity of who you are. Your personal brand is like, you're basically crystallizing who you are and telling that story into the world. So that people can follow you, and it's a business and all the things. But really the alchemy is it's in who you are. It's in who you're becoming. It's in who you curate yourself to want to become or to want to be.
Yeah. That brings up a good point. The concept of personal brand, like how important is that actually? Because I look at myself, and I was going through this process of like, how do I want, what sort of brand do I want in the world? And I was like, behind the scenes, I'm like wearing pink wigs and I'm like doing crazy shit and I'm in all the types of different relationships. And then to funnel all of that through into like what comes out into what other people see in these, few 3 words, how important is that to go through? Do we need personal brands?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you are somebody who is making a dent in the world, who wants to is selling a product or a service, who you are, your brand, speaker, and author, and entrepreneur. I just did my last podcast was with AJ Vaden from the Brand Builders Group, and they did a whole study on the statistics of the personal brand. It was like something like 64% of Americans will are more likely to buy from you if you have an established personal brand. So there is a lot of statistics in the space of actual, monetary movement and trust. You're building trust with people. Everything today now is so much about the personal brand. If that's your world, if that's your business, if that's your world. It's like I always say, like, if you don't have a business that you're pushing, why do you don't really need an Instagram?
Yeah, I feel the same way.
It's like, why put all this time and extra energy into all of that, right? Unless there's an ROI on it. So yeah, I mean, building a personal brand is definitely, I think, highly important if you are doing these kinds of things. You are a coach, or you're a leader, or you're a speaker in the world, where you are your service, you are your brand. You definitely it's definitely something that you need to pay attention to. I think telling the story of who you are, it's like, if I was to do a photo shoot with you, be like, oh yeah, let's bring out some of those pink wigs, and like, what are these different sides of you that will connect people with you, right? That tells the story of who you are and what you're creating in the world, because people want to know that story, and that's what draws people into you, is story, right? Visual story, audio, or like, video story as well. But
it's interesting. So I've recently been in a conversation with a colleague of mine, and we were talking about personal brands, and hers is very neutrals, very flowy, like very Illuminati kind of vibes, like and Mexican vibes. And I look at myself and I'm like, I'm like loud and neons, but then also, Polly, and I feel like I don't have a brand, but I think I actually do without realizing it.
We all have one, whether we realize it or not. So I think the identity alchemy process is actually taking that awareness and taking control of what you are putting out into the world, right? It's like it's like being aware of the brand that you're creating and telling the story that you want to tell intentionally and consciously, versus like just letting people make their own story of you, right? Which
I think people are already making people are already making stories about me, Nick.
Of course.
I can feel it.
We all do.
Yeah. Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex Love Psychedelics.